Welcome back to another episode of Consciously Clueless. I'm your host, Carly, and I'll be your guide on this journey from consciousness to cluelessness and back around again. Thanks for joining me on another Sunday solo episode. Whether it's Sunday evening, you're getting ready for the week, Monday morning, you're on your way to work, or whatever day this episode has found you, I'm glad you're here. Before we get started, I'm going to read the Apple Podcast review of the week. This 5-star review is titled Captivating and Insightful and comes from Lady of the Lake 70. This podcast is packed with fascinating people and their stories. I love the wisdom and new ways of seeing the world I gain from listening. Carly is such an engaging person that her interviews make you feel like you are a part of an important, insightful, and changing conversation with friends. Thank you so much for that review. I love the idea of all of you feeling like you're a part of the conversation, because those are my favorite podcasts. So if I can deliver that to all of you, that is exactly what I'm trying to do. This week, I am coming to you from Kansas in the U.S. instead of Minnesota. I am visiting my best friend, Kris, and we were talking about his job, and he shared a new thing they are doing for checking in with each other called P.I.E.S. And it was brought to him by his graduate assistant. And I loved this idea so much, check your P.I.E.S, which sounds so funny, that I wanted to share it with all of you. So I think we're becoming more and more aware of the fact that we have to check in on each other. Everything that's going on in 2020, there's been a lot of conversation about mental health, about checking on your friends, and about all of that, which is amazing. But I think sometimes we still get stuck in just asking that question, how are you? Which often elicits the response, oh, I'm fine. Instead of kind of digging in and asking in a way that might elicit a different response. And I think this idea of P.I.E.S, P-I-E-S, does that. So what P.I.E.S is physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. P-I-E-S. Physical, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual. So what my friend was describing was that when they check in during a staff meeting, they all talk about how they are doing in these 4 categories, which is amazing because not only does it make for better conversation when someone says, how are you doing? But it makes everybody check in with themselves on a different level as well. Because I know that if we're not as tuned in, myself included, it can be easy to just think, okay, yeah, I'm doing okay. Really, what you're doing is surviving. And we want to be thriving, not just surviving. So checking in with ourselves physically, intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. So let me talk about each one of those a little bit to give you an idea of what that can look like. Because those words might mean different things to different people, which is okay. So according to this Wellness Vibrations website, the physical dimension recognizes the need for physical activity. So I've talked about that a lot, the need for being physically active, but also just checking in with our bodies physically. How is our body feeling today? Maybe it's sore because you did a workout. Maybe it's feeling kind of heavy and lethargic because you haven't moved. Or maybe you just haven't checked in with that and you're kind of starting to discern, what does my body feel like physically today? So that can mean a lot of things to different people, but often that physical development is like diet and nutrition and movement and lifestyle. So we can check in on that physical wellness and think, have we taken care of ourselves physically today? And how does that feel? Or did we not? And how does that feel? I think the physical is probably the most self-explanatory one of these because we talk about that more than some of these other ones. So the I in P.I.E.S is intellectual. So according to this Wellness Vibrations website, like I quoted before, I'll put that in the show notes so you can all see if you want to look into it a little more because I'm just paraphrasing. The intellectual dimension recognizes one's creative, stimulating mental activities. So it goes on to say that a well person expands his or her knowledge and skills while discovering the potential for sharing their gifts with others. So intellectually, how are you doing? And it doesn't just have to be because you're a teacher or a student or in that setting. I think we think of intellectual in that setting. But you can explore issues of being creative and learning and pursuing personal interests that are intellectually stimulating to you, which is really just being curious and wanting to learn. And I know that all of you are listening are curious beings, intellectually curious beings that want to learn because you're listening to a podcast, which is a really great way to learn and to be curious intellectually. So the E in P.I.E.S is emotional. That website states that the emotional dimension recognizes awareness and acceptance of one's feelings. I'm going to read that again. Awareness and acceptance of one's feelings. It's one thing to be aware of how we're feeling. It's another thing entirely to accept it. So they go on to say that emotional wellness includes the degree to which one feels positive and enthusiastic about oneself and life. It also has to do with those satisfying relationships with other people. So that emotional check-in is, how are you doing on that level? How are you feeling today? What is your state of being today emotionally? Are you feeling sad about the world? Are you feeling really excited? Did you wake up feeling grateful? And not only just recognizing that, but then owning that and saying, okay, that is just how I'm feeling today. That emotional check-in is really, really important. We really, in our Western capitalistic society, try and stifle that emotional intelligence, I would argue. And it's so important to be connected to how we're feeling, because how we're feeling and how we're showing up emotionally is dictating the rest of our actions. I bet you can all think of a time when you were upset and then everything just started to go wrong after that. Or when you're really happy, things seem to go a little easier. Our emotions are dictating how the rest of our world is going. So this one is really important, I would argue. Spiritual, the final one, is the S. So I think this is one that would probably be, maybe if I'm making an assumption, hardest for most people, because it's not something we talk about in this way. So this website states that the spiritual dimension recognizes our search for meaning and purpose in human existence. Whoa, I'm going to read that one again. The spiritual dimension recognizes our search for meaning and purpose in human existence. That's a big sentence. That's a really big sentence, but it's also because it's really important. So that spiritual connection, I think when people say spiritual, they think of religion or specifically churches. And maybe that's what that means to you, but it doesn't have to be. It can be this broader search for that connection and that purpose in life. Like, what are we here to do? What am I here to do? So it goes on to say that it includes the development of a deep appreciation for the depth and expanse of life and natural forces that exist in the universe. Your search will be characterized by a peaceful harmony between internal personal feelings and emotions and the rough and rugged stretches of your path. Ooh, I love that. I love that, because that's what spirituality, if you're looking at it with this lens, is, right? It's that recognizing our search for growth and change and harmony between everything that's going on in our outside world and checking in with our feelings, like we talked about before, that emotional intelligence. So it's really just like connecting all these things, to me at least. This spiritual component is connecting all of the other three to the outside world in this bigger way, which I love, because to me, that's kind of the point of this podcast. It's taking all these ideas about personal growth and personal wellness and personal health and personal consciousness, and then translating that to the health of others and the wellness of others and this collective consciousness, because you need both. We have to have that personal awareness to be able to connect to the bigger picture and the bigger idea. So I love this. He only told me about this yesterday, and as soon as he told me about this P.I.E.S check-in, check your P.I.E.S, I instantly knew that I wanted to do this for the solo episode, because I think it could be so useful, whether it's a work setting or whether it's friends, or maybe a morning journal practice or an evening journal practice to check in with ourselves. It doesn't necessarily have to be checking in with others, but really to check in with ourselves. I encourage you all to write P.I.E.S on a piece of paper. And even if you can write a sentence for each one. P.I.E.S. P, how am I feeling physically right now? I, how am I feeling intellectually right now? E, how am I feeling emotionally right now? And S, how am I feeling spiritually right now? And if this is something you're not used to, thinking about kind of our checking in with ourselves in this way, maybe you start with one or two and you build that ability to really be present, because we don't teach being present in the way that I would argue we should. And that can disconnect us from figuring out how we feel physically or intellectually or emotionally or spiritually, because we're always in the next moment, or we're living in those last moments that we wish wouldn't have happened. But how are you feeling right now? This can be a really good grounding practice, this P.I.E.S. I just love it so much, because it makes not only you, but the people that you're having this conversation with go deeper than just being able to say, I'm fine. And I have made a rule for myself that I don't always follow, but I try, that I am not going to say I'm fine or fine, because everyone knows that's a bullshit answer. When someone says I'm fine, they're not. We're not. It's just something you say because you don't want to get into it. And that's okay. You can draw your own boundary and say, I'm having a hard time, but I don't really feel like talking about it. That's different. That is at least acknowledging that feeling and drawing a boundary on if you want to get into it or not. That's different than saying, I'm fine, when you know darn well you don't mean it. That's stifling that true reality of how you're feeling. And that's not good. The more we do that, the harder it is to connect to how we're feeling or how we're doing physically, intellectually, whatever it is. And the harder that is, we just become disconnected from our bodies and our minds, and things are hard when we're disconnected. But when we're connected, things flow so much easier. It's easier to communicate with others. It's easier to figure out what we want. It's figuring out what we want to do with our lives. Like, all those things just seem so much more attainable to me when I am connected and when I'm tapped in and when I'm really present. I talked last week for the solo episode about my solo hike and it being really quiet for hours, and how I was really able to do this like manifesting work and see everything so clearly just because I was so present and quiet. And I think why I like this so much is because it's just another tool for mindfulness, but it's a really intentional one. So if this is something that appeals to you too, I really encourage you to check in with yourself right now. You don't have to write it down like I mentioned earlier. Even just take a moment after listening to this and check in with yourself physically, intellectually, emotionally, and spiritually. And then ask one person in your life. Ask one person in your life that question. That they should check in with their P.I.E.S. I mean, it's at least a good conversation starter because it sounds ridiculous. Check your P.I.E.S. And then you can kind of explain why. And it might feel awkward at first if that's not something you're normally used to doing or checking in with, but I guarantee you it'll lead to really good conversations if you're talking to somebody else about it, or a better understanding of yourself if you are just checking in with yourself on it. So check in with yourself, check your P.I.E.S. And if you are new to this or you are enjoying that practice or anything, let me know. Let me know how you're doing. I love hearing from you all after these episodes. I'll do my own little check-in with you all right now. Let's see. Physically, I am feeling a little tight. My body is feeling like I need to do some yoga or go for a walk because I drove to Kansas yesterday from Minnesota. So physically, I'm doing pretty good, but I could use some movement. That's how I'm feeling there. Intellectually, I would say I'm feeling very good because I'm recording this podcast and I am expanding my knowledge and sharing what I'm learning. So intellectually, I'm feeling very good. Emotionally, I am feeling really, really grateful for being able to visit my best friend and spend time with him. So emotionally, I'm also doing really well, although I will mention that I have had this emotional underlying anxiety about the state of the world that has just seemed to be present within my body for weeks now. So that's always, seems to be always there, lingering, and it's just louder or quieter at some moments. But I would say the louder part of my emotional check-in right now is just a lot of gratitude. And spiritually, I think spiritually I am feeling connected. Doing the work like this makes me feel connected to my purpose and makes me feel more connected to all of you listening. It makes me feel like I'm doing exactly what I should be doing, which makes me feel really in line with my source energy. And as I get more and more into manifesting, I can explain that in later episodes, but doing this work makes me feel really spiritually connected. So I'm going to say I'm doing really well spiritually as well. So it can be that quick. It doesn't have to be long. It can be just kind of a checklist real quick. Check your P.I.E.S. So that is my challenge to you this evening, or whenever you're listening to this podcast, is do that check-in, even just really quick. I bet you'll love it. Thanks for listening to another episode of Consciously Clueless. If you are enjoying this podcast, hit subscribe wherever you're listening. If you want to help me get this into the ears of more listeners, send it to a friend, text it to a family member, share on social media, whatever you can do to help me get this into the ears of more listeners, I would greatly appreciate. And if you want to be read on air as a podcast review of the week, head over to Apple Podcasts, leave a review, and you might hear your review on air in a future episode. Until next time.